This is our short story summary of Who's Irish by Tyler, Lauren, Andrea, Grace, and Jefferson.
This is a summary of a quick overview of the story. The short story, Who's Irish, is written by Jish Jen, a Chinese writer who graduated with a bachelor's in English from Harvard University. She explores the generational and cultural divides between China and other states, along with age differences. Who's Irish is about an elderly Chinese woman in America who is living with her daughter and helping raise her granddaughter, Sophie. The husband of her daughter, John, is an Irish, unemployed, depressed man who is unable to fully take care of Sophie. The daughter, Natalie, is a hard-working mother who cares for her small family with the help of her mother. Sophie is a toddler and is very energetic and a hard child to control. Sophie does things like take her clothes off in public and kick the grandmother. The grandmother states that she has never had to deal with such a badly behaved child, because in China, children are calmer because of discipline and are focused on academics rather than creativity. The grandmother wants to punish Sophie by spanking her, but the mother does not want that to happen. The grandmother does it anyway, and for a short while, Sophie behaves as she should. Sophie, one day, goes into a foxhole at the playground, and the grandmother tries to get her out by poking her. And hours pass before Natalie and John come to find the grandmother poking Sophie. They get Sophie out, and she is covered with bruises, and the parents are furious. Eventually, Natalie tells her mother that she needs to move out, and John's mother, Bess, offers her a place to live. Natalie and John come to visit sometimes, but do not bring Sophie. But Bess says they will soon come around. This is the post-colonial lens analysis. I said the story is narrated through the perspective of a Chinese woman who has immigrated to the United States. She has a daughter and a granddaughter. The narrator's daughter is married to an Irish man, so her granddaughter is mixed Irish and Chinese. And the grandmother is very judgmental of her daughter's child, Sophie, and just overall very judgmental of people because she has these traditional Chinese viewpoints, and she feels like since Sophie is growing up in America, like she's being raised more creative and she's not disciplined like she should be, like a traditional Chinese girl. So the reader gets to see cultural differences between Chinese, Irish, and Americans. And in this story, the grandmother, the narrator, she depicts Chinese people as very hardworking and intelligent people. And just specifically in this story, she views the Irish as lazy because her daughter's husband is just very lazy and an unemployed man. So this is not the colonized aspect of the post-colonial lens, rather the representation of marginalized groups in America. And the narrator, being from China, has many different views on how children in America act, and she's just very judgmental throughout the entire story. And I think the main conflict can be viewed as a cultural conflict, because the main conflict is that the narrator, being from China, is upset at the way her granddaughter, Sophie, is being raised in America. And she isn't being raised in that traditional Chinese way where she's disciplined and more focused on education, and this just makes the grandmother upset. And my two questions are: how does the narrator's Chinese background affect the reader's interpretation of the story and other cultures in the story, such as the Irish? And how does this story represent Chinese society in America? What are the differences between the narrator's ideals and that of traditional American ideas?
Okay, so I had biographical lens, and so uh, Jin was born as Lillian Jin in 1995 in the suburbs of New York. She grew up as an Asian American and Catholic. At a young age, Jin's family moved to a predominantly Jewish suburbs. There, her future stories were influenced by Chinese culture and Jewish American ones. Jen was surrounded with literature practically her life. She would later then graduate Harvard University with a bachelor's degree in English as well as a major fine arts in creative writing from the University of Iowa. Jen ties her life in the short story Who's Irish. The narrator who's a Chinese grandmother has a daughter named Natalie who married an Irish American man named John Shia. Together they have a daughter named Sophie. The grandmother's family represents the Chinese side Jen had grown up with personally, while John's family represents the Jewish American community she grew up with around as a young girl. The grandmother had mentioned briefly about the how the Jews and the Chinese worked hard on the railroad. The brief mention relates back to the Industrial Revolution era, where those who built the railroad included immigrants from China and um, Ireland. That event took place in America, where both groups had immigrated for better lives for their families and their children. In the situation of immigrant um, Im, immi- uh, immigration, the immigrants had to grow accustomed to American culture, including the government. The grandmother mentions the railroad in the beginning of this short story to foreshadow the connections with her and Natalie and John's family. The grandmother was an immigrant herself and left China for a better life with her husband, Natalie, in South America. When the grandmother's husband passed, the grandmother wanted to work hard to keep her family together. That involved keeping her Chinese traditions alive and putting them onto Natalie and Sophie. Overall, Jin uses Who's Irish to bring about the contrast between Chinese people and Jewish American people. Though the grandmother's through the grandmother's discipline for Sophie. These contrasts refer to Jin's knowledge of her Chinese side growing up, but as well as the predominant Jewish suburbs she's moved to as a child. It's it's the sense to be it's the sense to be uh aware of the culture around you, not to but don't lose the culture you grew up with as a whole. A few examples of the contrast or orders that the grandmother gives are that Chinese children don't take off their clothes or act wild. Chinese kids get punished versus American kids uh, discussing about what they did wrong, and Chinese kids respect their elders versus American kids who like kick their elders. So my questions are: how do you think Jin would have applied the grandmother's traditional um, Chinese beliefs if the short story was more centered around religion instead of dealing with ethnicity? Uh, if you grew up in two different cultures, which culture would you influence more? maybe influenced by you would influence you more? Your parents slash family or the people you hang around with, such as your friends?
So, the gender and feminist lens. This story allows the readers to have a further insight on how different cultures respect and diminish certain gender roles. Jin illustrates how Chinese gender roles differentiate from American gender roles. The grandmother believes it's taboo of the Shea sons who don't work. She doesn't approve that her daughter goes out and works and makes the money, while her husband stays home and takes care of their child. A quote from the short story: I especially cannot understand my daughter's husband, John, who has no job but cannot take care of Sophie either. Because he is a man, he say, and that's the end of the sentence. The grandmother in this quote is complaining to her daughter, Natalie, about how her husband does not work. In Chinese culture, the man of the house is expected to go out and work while the mother stays home with the child. This is different from American culture, where it is not out of the ordinary or disrespectful if the husband stays home with the children. Furthermore, in the last quote, when the husband John explains that he can't stay home and take care of his child, this reinforces the ideals of toxic masculinity. There's an idea behind most cultures that the women must take care of their children. This is spawned through thousands of years of patriarchy and how women are meant to make children, make food, and stay at home. The quote here: she has to write memo while her husband go to the gym to be a man. My daughter say otherwise he will be depressed. Seems like all his life he has this trouble, depression. The husband in this story claims to be depressed, yet goes to the gym to be a man. The husband goes to the gym to compensate for not having a traditional role in his family when it's perfectly fine to stay home with his child. This is an example of how toxic masculinity plays a huge part in gender roles in a family. The questions we have here: how does this short story protest standard American gender roles by having the mother work and the father stay at home? And the second one: what values and traditions does that grandmother have that stick to the classic gender roles in both Chinese and American cultures? The reader's response lens. Now, this may be different depending on how you read it and who's analyzing the lens. So the story allows the reader to develop their own reflections as a result of thoroughly reading the text and evaluating a personal response to it. Right off the bat in Who's Irish, you can tell that it is written in a broken English, using phrases such as, I am work hard my whole life, and if they come by mistake, they pretend they are come to eat. This really helps us to see that we are reading from the point of view of someone who is not from America, someone who English is their second language. An adult has moved to America, and that is the point of view we are reading from. As we read further into the story, we see the Chinese culture really start to shine in the grandmother. She criticizes the Irish family her daughter has married into by wondering why they're having such a hard time finding work. They are white and they speak English. How hard could it be, she says. It really gives the reader a sense that the grandmother is not very familiar with the disappointment of the American dream. Just because you are white and speak English does not mean that you are set for life. So in this, it kind of gives us an outside interpretation of what others believe America is like. So the grandmother obviously greatly dislikes her daughter's husband, but maybe with a valid reason. The fact that he's depressed and really the gym is the only thing that can help him for some reason. And that Natalie is having to work and having to discipline her child. The grandmother states that in China, things are spoken on how difficult they are. There is no real creativity. In China, a daughter is also not as good as a son. So in China, essentially, she's saying children are more disciplined and better behaved than children in America, as well as she has a granddaughter. And as we stated previously, she's very judgmental. She's constantly saying that she has a little brown granddaughter. So her skin color is still extremely in effect here. Um, we do believe that she has good intentions for her granddaughter, but she is definitely still a traditional Chinese woman. She disciplines Sophie because she does things like take off all her clothes in public and hit and scare the grandmother, all of which are not acceptable in general public. I'd say a majority of readers would agree with that. Sophie does get away with too much stuff and needs to be disciplined in some way. Reading this short story, there were many aspects of it that relate to real life and how we view our own world and think. As someone who's never raised a child before, however, there are many different ideals that must be taken into consideration. The two impeding ideals on how to raise Sophie force us to kind of take a side in this. Speaking from personal experience, spanking as a form of punishment did well to negate bad behavior. It is understandable, though, if parents choose not to, but definitely not overlooked as a way to punish a child. So in the short story, it did work for a little while. It says in a quote here, "Still Sophie take off her clothes until one day I spank her. Not too hard, but she cry and cry, and when I tell her if she doesn't put her clothes back on, I'll spank her again. She put her clothes back on. Then I tell her she is a good girl and give her some food to eat. The next day we go to the park, and like a nice Chinese girl, she does not take off her clothes." So that kind of proves that punishment does work. However, the grandmother overlooks her daughter's wishes about spanking Sophie. The daughter does not want Sophie to be spanked, but rather, a quote, "Use your words," my daughter say. That's what we tell Sophie. How about if you set a good example? The only problem with this in my analysis is that a parent and child are not on the same level. You cannot talk to a toddler, especially, as your equal in maturity and age, because it's just not. Your job as a parent is to raise your child to be a good person. And the story really allowed us to see both sides of trying to raise a child one way and how another person believes that their child should be raised. It became obvious that you cannot go against the parents in almost all scenarios because you're simply not their parent. And so that really changed the way that some would read the story. You saw what would happen and how the disconnect happens between families. And the reader's response questions. The grandmother and daughter have very different beliefs on how Sophie should be raised/disciplined. In your opinion, how do you think a child of so much energy should be controlled and looked after? And our second question, how did your view of the mother and daughter relationship change from before you read the short story to after? Do you think mother and daughter relationships change when the daughter becomes a mother?
This is the new historicism lens. Cultural concepts change as time goes on, and this is very prevalent in this short story compared to, or as the grandmother finds it culturally okay to physically punish Sophie compared to the mother and the father who do not want their daughter to have physical punishments like spanking. And two quotes to show this are, "You spank her, she'll stop. I say another day." And that's by the grandmother, who is much older than both the mother and the father. And then the mother saying back to that, "I don't want you to touch Sophie. No spanking, period." Our new historicism continued. Our understanding of events is based on who we grow up with and when we grew up. There are two main perspectives. One may view the story from the first being the grandmother's perspective, that physical punishments are needed to shape a child into an adult, or the mother's and father's perspective, that all you need is to punish them, or dang it, sorry, is to push them in the right direction. This is shown in the quotes, the grandmother growing up, or dang it, this is shown by the grandmother growing up in traditional China, where there are strict cultural expectations of children and adults, and those shaped her belief. And the quotes that show this is, I have a daughter. I say, Chinese people don't think a daughter is so great, but you're right, I have a daughter. And that's the gender roles in their cultural beliefs. And the second is, you never take off your clothes when you were little. I say, all my Chinese friends had babies. I never saw one of them act wild like that. And those are continuing the roles or idea that children have strict ways that they need to act to turn them into functioning adults. And then the mother and father's cultural perspectives, especially the father growing up in a less traditional setting and being more free to be who they wanted to be, and the mother experiencing the physical punishments that shape their beliefs. And the quote that shows that is, in America, parents should not spank their child. It gives them low self-esteem, my daughters say, and that leads to problems later, as I happen to know. Questions for my lens are, what in the grandmother's past could have led to such a difference in the culture between her daughter, and the Shea family? And what time period would the grandmother look like a good parent and the others a bad parent? And what time period would she look like a bad parent? And what time period are we a part of in regards to if she is a good or bad parent?